Okay, webinar is started. Hello and good evening, everyone. We will start the second lecture of the Masterclass series now. So first, let me welcome back, of course, our speakers and all the participants to the fifth Masterclass series on critical and emerging technologies conducted by the Ananta Aspen Center. We continue the conversation on semiconductors with Pranay Kothasane, the chair of high-tech geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution, and the co-author of his most recent book, When the Chips Are Down, among, of course, various others. Lecture 2 of the Masterclass series will look at VLSI design and India's semiconductor policies. The series of masterclasses are possible thanks to the generous support of Triveni Turbines Limited. Few housekeeping rules, same as last time. Please add your questions in the chat window as the session progresses, and we will raise them during the Q&A session. With this, I hand over to the speaker, Pranay Kothasane.
Thanks, Vidur. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the second session. What I will do in this session is to not present a lot. So I'll largely talk so that we have a different kind of a session. And I'll take a lot of questions. So let's discuss about India's semiconductor journey and what are the things which are happening now? Are they any different? And basically anything related to semiconductors and the geopolitics and politics of it, we can take it up. Just a brief note on how I plan to present it. So initially what I'll do is just give you an idea of the various attempts that India has made in order to make inroads into this segment over the since 1950s and 60s actually. So we'll go through that. Thereafter, I will talk about the recent attempts and what has been going on. And then I'll just open it up to questions so that we can have a lot more focused questions rather than me going on and on. Okay, so that's the plan. Let me begin by just talking about India's previous attempts, right? So now, whenever you see news, there's almost, I mean, around 3-4 years ago, no one even considered semiconductors as quote unquote technology because these chips used to just come to you, right? I mean, we don't need to bother about a supply chain if it is working fine. Why would you bother about it? Because it just works absolutely fine. So when we talked about technology in the past few years, it was largely synonymous with software and what was happening there. But now, for the three reasons that I told you about technological, geopolitical, and geoeconomic, suddenly hardware and semiconductors have come to the fore, and a lot of governments are taking interest in it, including India's. Okay. So when this happens, there's a lot of news coverage about semiconductors, like complete mirror image to what was happening earlier. Earlier, as in completely 180-degree shift. Earlier, you didn't hear anything about the sector. Now, every single day, there is some or the other news item. So it's quite easy to get lost in the kind of news that comes in. So I thought with this session, you will have a better understanding of actually how to analyze what's happening in this domain. So first of all, one kind of news item that you'll often see when observing this is that people will often highlight one catastrophic event on one policy because of which India's semiconductor manufacturing hasn't taken off. Okay, so for example, in the semiconductor manufacturing space, people will often talk about there was one fire which happened, an industrial fire which took place in India's only commercial semiconductor manufacturing facility way back in 1989. This was in Chandigarh, the SCL, Semiconductor Complex Limited. So there was a industrial fire, and often people cite that as the reason why India couldn't become something like Japan or South Korea or Taiwan in this sector. Right? But obviously, such kind of unicausal explanations are obviously simplistic and often they are plain wrong because these explanations make us think that if only that one failure point were avoided, we would have been in a much better place. But the reality is much more sobering, as people who understand public policy would know, because the reasons for policy failure are many. It's a if you think of it from a complex system lens, policy successes are often a result of many parts of the puzzle falling into place, right? So it's not just one master stroke move or one fire, which one master stroke move can't make things great, and one fire can't make things go totally down south either, right? So it's somewhere in between that we need to think of all the various factors that go into building advanced manufacturing and in the semiconductor domain. So we need to think of the essential ingredients that go into creating a good policy recipe, right? So in many times in the past, these essential ingredients which go into making a successful policy recipe were missing, and that's what we'll talk about now. Okay. So broadly, we've tried to analyze India's semiconductor journey, and we've tried with thought of dividing it into three broad versions. So first version was, we call it by the government and for the government. The second version was called the unease of doing business in India. And the version 3 is what is happening now. And the question is it different from what was happening in the past? So let's start with the version 1 and what happened there. Okay. So obviously, semiconductors, ICs, even though in the common parlance it has come to our notice only in the last 4 5 years, but semiconductors have always been on top of government thinking since the 1950s and 60s. When I told you in the last session, when in the 1950s you had the first integrated circuit, and even before that you had the transistor. So even the Indian government has been thinking about transistors, ICs from back then as well. The idea was, can we have some of these transistors, ICs being made in India? And build we did. So there were government companies which did start making transistors and ICs in India. So there were two companies largely in India. One was the Bharat Electronics Limited, which started working on transistors since 1960s. And then there was Semiconductor Complex Limited in Chandigarh, which again was trying to make integrated circuits. Okay. So both of them were government-run enterprises, and it was not unusual at that period of time for government-run companies to run a fab, right? Because back then, the dominant notion in government was that private sector doesn't have enough capacity, and it is the government which should have the primary role in many important industries. So this was also the trajectory that USSR took and China took. So India, China, and USSR, all largely very controlled economies, followed similar paths in the initial 4 5 decades in the semiconductor industry, and all of them failed in that version. Okay, so USSR doesn't have any semiconductor manufacturing capability. China failed in this version, and in fact, they also had the Cultural Revolution, and they had whatever advances they had made, they sort of fell back on it. But then, starting 1996 and after 1978, opening up of their economy, they started picking things up since 1996. There were people who came back from the US, restarted the industry, and the environment for doing business had improved a lot. And after that, whatever you see, the progress that China has made is a story of after 1990s. It's not about what was done earlier. Okay, so let's think about this version 1.0 of India's journey. So first, Semiconductor Complex Limited, as I told you, is one of the companies. It started making chips at the 5,000 nanometer range in 1984. So, and SCL at back then had good monetary backing from the government. It had a reasonable pool of graduates and PhDs from top in Indian engineering college. It had also had access to talented scientists from defense and space and aerospace. So, okay, the like in many of these government run projects, initially there were successes. So SCL did start making these chips, and they also had technology transfer coming in from other countries. So, for example, SCL got technology transfer from a US company called Microsystems Incorporation, and also from some Japanese companies like Hitachi, another US firm called Rockwell Automation, etc. So, as part of that technology transfer, SCL started making more advancements, and over the years, it had reached from 5,000 nanometers. So one transistor was big, 5,000 nanometer. Today we talk about 5 nanometers, but that was 5,000 nanometer. And over time, they made progresses and they went down to the 800 nanometer range as well. So they were getting better over time. But over time, they couldn't keep up pace with others globally competitive players, right? So just imagine, as I told you last time, apart from Moore's law, the flip side to Moore's law is also the Rock's law, right? The capital cost keeps doubling every 4 years. So you need to have an industrial setup which can invest twice the capital cost every 4 years, right? So how will that come up? That will only come up if you're producing large volume of commercial chips and selling it to the world. Right? Then you can recoup some money, invest in R&D, also invest in the next round of capital investments. But this is not what government firms are set up to do. They are not set up to export. They were not, there's no incentive for them to chase commercial products in other countries in order to make profits. Right? So they didn't do that, and obviously because they didn't have enough money coming in as revenues, uh, they couldn't make those capital investment. And also think about Indian government situation back then. India liberalization hadn't happened. The economy wasn't doing great either. So the government also refused to reinvest this time and time again. So over time, what happened is that SCL just started dropping its production and only supplying and even limiting its vision to supplying to government players, so specialized defense or specialized aerospace requirement, which are really small, right? You are not going to make a lot of money selling those. So that's what they limited themselves to, and eventually that meant they fell further behind due to Rock's law. And that 800 nanometer today is at 180 nanometers, and it is far, far behind the cutting edge. And also, it does not do any commercial manufacturing now at all. It does very low volume production for either research purposes or for government needs. In 2000, the Ministry of Information Technology back then tried to, in fact, sell SCL's equity, but there were no buyers. And after that, the Department of Space took it over, and its focus from 2005 remained only to supply to ISRO and supply to the specific needs of the space industry. And only in the last 2 years or so, it has again been brought into the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and now the government is talking about infusing new capital into it, and hopefully over time they want to actually privatize it so that it can do commercial production and its incentives align with large scale, large volume production that can get them the money, revenue to, and the capital to reinvest over time. Okay, so that was the journey of SCL. Of course, there was also the fire in 1989, which just added more trouble to this already declining trajectory. But it was not as if there weren't any fire, India would have been a very different power in semiconductor manufacturing. The second public sector giant in this industry is Bharat Electronics Limited, BEL. And it started to manufacture germanium chips way back in 1959. Okay. And again, it had a technology transfer arrangement with good companies. So, like Philips helped them with the knowledge transfer. And by 1962, it made its first transistor, which was put into the market. So that was the first part. And by 1980s, it was making up to 20 million transistors annually. So there was some production happening. And then they also wanted to get not just into making transistors, but also getting into integrated chip design and integrated manufacturing as well. But there again, if the story is similar, they also start hitting the constraints of Rock's law. Also, the foreign exchange situation is very tight in India, so they are not able to import a lot of new equipment as well. Like I told you, no one is fully Atmanirbhar in this. So even for BEL to start making the next node of chips, they need to import some machinery. Now that machinery should be allowed by the government to be imported, or they should have low import tariffs on it. There shouldn't be extensive licensing requirements, etc. But back in the 1980s, that was the norm. So it was very difficult for them to import things quickly. And again, the result was that they fell out of this race very quickly. Okay, so the interesting part also is that when you are outside the government, competition in any sector is generally a very good incentive for companies to innovate, right? So if there is many companies in a sector, pro competition and pro market policy is to have many players such that they will try to compete with each other, reduce costs to the customer, and also try to innovate on things. But when both of these entities were government run, competition was seen as a negative feature rather than a positive feature. Because from a government perspective, it was like there's Rock's law. I am the pool of money that I have to put into both the companies is the same. It's coming from the government. So the government said, why should I also put money in BL and SCL? This competition is not good. So they actually told BL to stop making chips, and they restricted it to only doing integration and electronics assembly. And they told SCL is our chosen player, only it should do chip manufacturing. And we've already discussed what happened with SCL. So, with that, India's manufacturing journey in the first phase sort of pretty much ended, and we don't make any commercial chip manufacturing today. Okay. By the way, the players involved in it, say the industry, like I told, Philips was involved. There was also RCA, Radio Corporation of America, which was involved in the technology transfer. So the problem was not that there was no technology coming from other countries. In fact, because manufacturing was not that big a deal it is today. The many companies in the West were willing to partner and outsource it to other players, and that's why East Asia also got some presence in this segment. Right? Remember, at back then it was also environmentally polluting. It was also not very high value addition. So the companies in other countries were okay to let it move to other places. So in fact, the company Radio Corporation of America was also the company which was the company which invested in TSMC, and it was a TSMC's first technology partner. And the same company also was involved with BEL. So it was not as if there was strong barriers. They could at least technically get the initial technology transfer. But then TSMC went on a completely different trajectory compared to where BEL. Right? So from all these experiences, we can derive three important lessons for why this kind of model fails in the semiconductor industry, and it equally applies to USSR and China. Right? First, as I said, government-run companies have no incentive to compete in a hyper-competitive space, which demands constant capital infusion and technology upgradation. So, if you don't have large volume commercial production meant for exports across the world, then you will fall behind because you're not going to make enough money selling to specialized players in defense and space sector. Second, these companies were shielded from internal competition, and I gave you an example. BL and SCL, there were turf wars, and then government said one of the companies will only do it in IC manufacturing. Contrast that with what happened in Taiwan. Even though the starting approach was a government-led ERSO, but it spun off many of the manufacturers, commercial manufacturers, into multiple companies. Okay, and they had very active competition. So in Taiwan, you also had TSMC, PSMC, you also had UMC. All these were different firms in the private sector which were competing with each other. They were Even though government would have given them subsidies, they were not government run projects. Okay, so their incentives were very different from what were placed for BEL and SCL. The third one was inward looking trade and business policies also proved costly. So because the economic narrative back then was that there is the foreign exchange is costly, we have very limited foreign exchange. We can't let that go for buying imports. So as I said, these companies weren't able to buy the most advanced machinery, quickly make chips. So by the time their customers, let's say in defense or space, wanted something that these companies couldn't deliver, and when by the time these companies could make that product after going through all the hassles of importing things, their customers had already imported the equivalent product from players abroad, right? So this kind of inward looking trade business policy also proved costly. So based on these reasons, this was the first version of India's semiconductor policy and why it failed. Let me go to the second version now. The second version, we call it the unease of doing business. So this roughly starts after liberalization. Okay, so now in this section, there is some success. So remember, by this time, 1991, there is also the comparative advantage based specialization model, which I talked to you about high globalization and no one company doing the entire part of the semiconductor supply chain. There are segments, and each company tries to specialize in some part of it, leaving the others to another industry player. That had taken root by 1991, right? So, companies in the US were happy giving some part of the design to some other geography in the world, right? There also, because now design companies didn't have to invest in manufacturing, they started putting a lot more money in R&D, building bigger design teams. So they could do that design elsewhere, right? And also with the development of information technology, incoming of computers, you could have teams working in a dispersed manner across the world. You didn't need them to have be in one place. So with that, there was some positive news for India. There was design work started coming to India, and as I told you last time, also the first company which started first MNC to set up shop in Bangalore was Texas Instruments, which is a semiconductor company. So India's Silicon Valley is actually nomenclature is right because the first company was not a was a company which makes semiconductors. Right? So that was what happened in 1985. So this outsourcing started. There were a lot more companies which started doing work in India, and by 2000s you had uh, many top fabulous players having their design centers and R&D centers in India. And today, top 10 of all the top 10 fabulous firms in the world, all top 10 have some design operations being done in India at varying levels. Some do very high architecture level cutting edge work, some do back end level work, but there is definitely improvement in the kind of work that gets handed over to the design centers here. Okay. So that was in design, but in manufacturing, the story was similar. There were many attempts made outside the government this time with some government support to start manufacturing and assembly as well. So first there was in 2006, there was an attempt by AMD and other companies to start a fab city in Hyderabad. And the idea was, again, this will be an assembly plant, and eventually it will also start doing manufacturing. But again, that didn't fructify, and then 2008 happened, the global financial crisis. Even AMD's model changed. The entire industry of manufacturing consolidated because of increasing capital costs. If you have to spend $2-3 billion to set up one manufacturing facility, it becomes very difficult for uh, players to have a role there. So the number of firms which were doing this contract manufacturing declined, and they started taking lesser risks after 2008, especially with the GFC. And India was a risky place to invest also, given that there was no experience of doing this. And in general, large scale manufacturing in India is difficult, not just in semiconductors, but you can think of any large scale manufacturing. It is not ideal, right? So that was the situation back then as well. Now, after Fab City, there were other attempts. In 2014, there were another fresh round of attempts made. And in fact, there were two investor groups which said that they want to do manufacturing. And they also had technology partners from outside India. So, for example, one of the consortia was comprised JP Group, Tower Jazz, which is an Israeli manufacturing firm, and IBM. And another consortium was India's HSMC, France's ST Microelectronics, and Malaysia's Silterra. So all these are players which do have some manufacturing capability outside India. Okay. But then again, with this attempt, there were initial promises made, but both these attempts also folded soon after. In 2015, again, there was a US firm called Cricket Semiconductors wanted to set up an analog foundry manufacturing facility in Madhya Pradesh, and there were again talks with the government that we are going to do that, but that also didn't fructify, and we didn't have. So, what can we derive? What lessons can we derive from this version of India's many attempts? Right. So, again, what the lessons that we think that unite these failures is there was a poor environment for businesses in general, and there was a combination of three factors: uncertain tax and policy environment, poor infrastructure, and high trade barriers. These three sort of combine to make chip fabrication unattractive in India. Right? So again, remember, chip manufacturing, it requires high capital cost, and also there's a long gestation period. Right? So if a company would have tried to invest in 2012, they would have probably completed the construction in 2015-16, and then they will have to keep improving their recipe for making chips such that they are able to get more yields, more profitability. So it's a 4 5 year old process to get from start to making some revenue by selling those chips. So just imagine, you need investors who are confident that there will not be any change in the policy environment, tax environment, trade environment for at least the next 5 years, until they are able to make some money, right? In fact, they would want policy continuity for a long period. But that was not the case during this period, right? So also India did things like retrospective taxation, where suddenly you were taxing a firm going backwards, right, in time, and taxing them. So all those things sort of spooked a lot of investors, especially the investors where the in sectors where gestation period is very large. So there was largely fear amongst investors that why do take this risk of investing in a country which has these issues, right? And there can be suddenly even the trade environment wasn't great. Post 2011 12, there was also a lot of policy uncertainty. Many of these large investment projects weren't going through in many sectors. So all that sort of led to another era where largely these industries couldn't take off. Okay, so that was version 2.0, and I explained to you why that failed. Now version 3.0 is what is happening now. So is there anything new in this version is what we are going to talk about next. I'll just share one. In fact, we've done a SWOT analysis of India's semiconductor industry. So you can check that if you just search for SWOT analysis Takshashila, you would get this paper, which tries to look at all the segments of this supply chain and where are India's strengths, weaknesses across all these segments. So I'm not going into that in great detail. But as you would know, this design segment I told you is human capital intensive. You require large number of engineers, and in the story that I told you, I did mention that in design, India does reasonably well. There are lots of design centers already in India of the top fabulous makers across the world, and there is also a design services industry which has developed. So these R&D centers further outsource their work to services firms, which are again largely Indian. So India does have presence in this. It requires a large number of engineers, and India has reasonably well qualified engineers to do this. Of course, the talent quality varies, but many of these industries do in-house training, etc., to improve the capability. So it's not ideal, but it is quite robust. Then there is manufacturing, which I told you is capital intensive. So there we have not had many successes, and I told you many reasons of the past journeys. And the third one is assembly, testing, and packaging, which is a labor intensive sector. So technically, it should be one place where India can quickly build presence, because labor costs are still low in India, and they were low back then as well. So if trade policy is supportive, tax policy is supportive, then assembly should be possible, because essentially you will need to import wafers, and you will need large assembly lines, and you're able to get, if you are able to get some machinery in, some advanced machinery, you will be able to produce chips at a lower cost rate. So that was the idea, but India didn't have any significant presence in assembly as well. So what has happened in the third version of the policies is that the government probably for the first time is trying to do things across all three segments. So it's not just about getting something in manufacturing, getting something in assembly, or getting one fab, but the vision is that the entire ecosystem should be developed in India, right? So there are separate policies for design segment, separate policies for the manufacturing segment, and separate policies for the assembly segment. There are also downstream policies for display fabs, etc. So that's the vision. And when you see news reports that there is a $10 billion policy by the government, or 76,000 crores, it is not just for one of these segments or to build a fab, but it is for all these various elements of the supply chain itself. So the government's that was sort of what the vision of the government was, and what was different about this. So earlier in the manufacturing segment, like I told you, the idea, you will get one fab up for after 5 years of construction and refining of their processes. So long duration, and the government back then was promising reimbursement. So something like the production linked incentives which you read about in the news papers today, that the government was saying, you start producing chips, when you start producing chips, we will reimburse some of the amount that of the production that you do, right? Just like in government is now doing for mobile phones, etc. But as you can see, for an investor, it is still very shaky, because for the first 5 years, you're not going to get any support, financial support from the government, and that too in an uncertain tax and policy environment. So, despite reasonable size of incentives, companies weren't coming for. So, in this version of the government policy, it's not a production linked incentives; it is actually upfront capital support. So, government is saying that for every 1 rupee you put for in a fab, we will back it with another 1 rupee, right? So there's a 50-50% cost sharing in the capital which is required to build the fab itself. So that has gotten some interest. Obviously, our policy environment, tax environment, intellectual property environment is still some way to go. There are some improvements with respect to GST, etc., but it's not ideal still. In fact, on trade, our import tariff restrictions have gotten even worse in the last few years. So, nevertheless, to compensate for that, the government is saying that we will reinvest the capital cost upfront with the private player, unlike in the past when the government was only willing to give reimbursements. So that has moved the needle on some of the things. So assembly, testing and packaging, one plant has come up. Micron, which is a well-known memory manufacturer based out of US, is building a plant in Sanand, Gujarat, and recently, just the news of the past 20 days, Tata Electronics and TSMC from Taiwan have announced that they are going to start a manufacturing facility or a fab in Dholera in Gujarat again, right? So these are two projects that are starting, and I had written back then as well that India will positively have at least one fab soon. So what does this all mean? First of all, as I have repeatedly told, this fab will not make India in any way self-sufficient. It will just mean that India will have some technical capability to know how to manufacture commercial chips. Maybe some startups might have easier access to prototyping and manufacturing fab, but largely it's the production capacity of these fabs will still be very small, and it is not doing work at the most advanced node either. So if you are buying an iPhone, your processor chips, or if you're buying a reasonably top end Android phone, your processor chips are going to come from outside India for at least the next 5 to 10 years. It's that is not going to change. Okay, so but yeah, you will have some form of capability building, just like it took 40 years for TSMC to learn this. Maybe India will shorten it, but it will still take a 20-year journey to at least hope of to become the top 3, 5 players. Okay. Simultaneously, in assembly, the pathway is much easier because of labor cost advantages. India can do something here. So there are many 3 or 4 proposals in this which have been green lighted, and you will see some development here. On design is where I think a lot more needs to be done, because that's where India's comparative advantage lies. But there are still policies which make it very difficult for startups to get the support that the government is promising. In fact, government wanted to support 100 startups, but as of what I read, only around 10 startups have been enrolled in under this scheme where they can be supported. So we can discuss this later if there are any questions about design. But my assessment of the policies thus far is that, one, the government is trying to do things across the ecosystem. So broadly, the thrust area is right, and the vision is, in my understanding, the government is chasing 3 objectives. One objective is that it wants to reduce vulnerabilities, that is, learn how to do manufacturing in the Indian ecosystem, which currently doesn't exist at all. Second goal is to reduce dependence on China as an adversary, and that's why they are doing a lot more on display fabs, so your mobile phone displays and etc. Those also they want to make in India. And the third one is they want to third goal is gaining, building or doubling down on comparative advantage. Okay, so that is build on design and build our strengths there. Now, the my complaint with the government policy is currently the prioritization probably should be changed. It should work a lot more to double down on our comparative advantage, so that we can quickly build this strength, and we have some particular leverage in the geopolitics of this supply chain. Whereas the focus on reducing dependence on China doesn't make sense to me, because it's not as if display fabs are strategic, and if a Chinese company were to stop supplying that to India, it's not as if Indian companies won't be able to import it from other players, because there are also suppliers in Japan and South Korea, so on and so forth. And there's nothing which is strategic in a display fab for which government need to invest money. So if they have to invest money, do a lot more in design, do and some form in manufacturing, just to learn this, but build strength in design and assembly where we have some existing comparative advantages already. Okay, so that is what sort of my assessment is, and I think with this I have tried to give you an overview of how the supply chain operates, what has India's experience been across the various segments, and where India stands today, and what you can foresee over the next 3 or 4 years. So with that, we have around 20 minutes, which I want to keep for Q&A. So I'll stop and we can take questions.
Thank you for that, Pranay. Excellent overview of, I think, one the policy with regard to semiconductors, but also I think a broader picture of India's industrial policy over the past few years. Um, so let's start with questions. Anybody who has any questions can feel free to drop them in the questions window down below. But till then, I will start with some of the questions we collected from the last session, which we kind of saved for this one. So last time, Kian had asked an interesting question, and there he said, in India, fabless chip makers have been on the rise. And he was talking about Moss chip and Octave. And he said that given the Indian government's dedication to achieving Atmanirbharta, does this spell disaster for the fabless business model in the future? So you're on mute.
Yeah, but I didn't understand the question. Why will it spell disaster for Fabulous? Uh, but let me try to address from what I understood from the question. See, so yeah, Fabulous, as I explained today, that there are three different segments, and the government policy currently is trying to support across the three segments, right? So now, what is the problem in the design segment, right? What happens is currently government policy says that now first, what do the design firms require? If you see that chart which I showed, they require very complex software tools to make those chips, as I told you, right? If you have to pack 134 million transistors per millimeter square, you can't do that by hand. You have specialized software to do that, and these softwares again are sort of an oligopoly. So there are three companies in the world which make these software, and other companies which use them to make chips largely have to license them. And so the license costs of these are very high. So for a startup, it becomes difficult to invest $1 million in getting some licenses to make these chips, right? And it's not as if you can get some pirated version of this software and run either. You will your product, you will get some cases filed, and you will be out of business. So the only ways can some government support them companies in getting these licenses, etc. So in fact, government has been trying to do that. So not just the union government, the state governments also have been trying to do that. So Karnataka, for example, has a semiconductor fabulous accelerator lab where they are trying to pool these resources together. So they have some licenses which they are giving to startups, and trying, it's like an incubator for semiconductor startup companies, and they are trying to reduce their costs by providing some like some of these licenses at cheaper costs, or provide some facilities for prototyping. Again, if a startup has to, actually a fabulous firm has to uh, prototype their product, where will they do that? No commercial manufacturing facility exists in India. They'll have to go to Malaysia, Silterra. There'll be delays. They might not get the slot. So again, you need someone to back them, and that's what the Indian government is again helping them in. Now, the problem here again is all that is good, but the challenge is that in my assessment there are two challenges. One, this policy is not being run by the India Semiconductor Mission, which has industry government partnership. So on the design side, the policy is run by CDAC, which is a government entity, and it has done some good job in making its own chips. But I really fear whether it has the regulatory capacity to identify which are the good ideas, which are the good startups, and also support them, right? Also, CDAC will be a competitor with many of these startups. So how will they manage this? I really am skeptical about it. The second thing is the government support for these startups is only 7 players or 10 players have come up, even though they wanted to build support 100 startups. The reason is that the policy currently says that you have to have majority Indian ownership, and also the policy is not clear of what happens with the intellectual property of the company if the company folds up. So what has happened is most of these firms, there's no venture capital ecosystem in India. So most of these firms will take money from outside India. They might not have majority Indian ownership. So my argument was that actually government should be more lenient with these requirements. The goal should be, we they will help an Indian private limited company. It can be an arm of a firm which is also has business in the US or other countries. But as long as they are transferring money to a private limited company in India, their arm in India, and they are making sure that a large amount of design work of their large portion of their design work is happening in India, should be okay even if the ownership is not Indian today, right? Over time, ownership will become Indian when you have a venture capital ecosystem. Today, you don't. So, if you want to achieve great success in the next 2 years, you're not going to be able to do that. Again, this is a 20-year game. It's a marathon. So, should the aim shouldn't be to make very strict policies which reduces the pool of applicants, which is the case today. That's the overall analysis of the design.
Right. So because now we're talking about kind of the 20-year scale, I think there are two questions that came up. One was Jayesh's, and he was asking that with an extremely robust and demanding industry need, especially with high tech and low latency computing and quantum computing, do you think the current scale of operation will be able to walk in tandem with the industry standards within the predicted range of the next 20 years? And if you want to take another question, which is kind of similar to Shar's, and he was asking that the government of India has approved major investments in semiconductor and electronics production that will include the country's first state-of-the-art semiconductor fab. On a global scale, how significant is this? And perhaps we can also talk a little bit about the current kind of geopolitical moment with chips when thinking about this one.
Okay, so you will have to remind me the second question later. Let me take the first one.
Sure.
So Jayesh's question. See, the industry demand is going to come from which sectors, right? So one, not so much from quantum, because right now we don't know where that will be and whether what will be the kind of demand. Too early to predict that. But the segments from where demand will come, I told you, like for example, automotives will be one big thing. Electric, as you have electric vehicles coming in, the bill of materials in a car for electronics and chips will go up significantly, right? So um, once you don't have an internal combustion engine and you in fact have largely things which are working on electromagnets and lithium batteries, you will need a battery management system. You need chips to do that. You will need chips to manage the electromagnets. All those things will require you to have significant increase in the chip content in automobiles. So transport will be one. AI will be another driver, because not just in terms of NVIDIA's chips, which is the current trend, but there is a lot of work happening on identifying new architectures which can work better for AI loads, right? So NVIDIA made graphics processors for something else, but it worked out very well for AI loads as well, because of the extreme parallelization required, which was also required for gaming, reducing latency there. It worked well for this as well. So they had the head start, but a lot of work is happening on specialized architectures which can work even better for handling AI load. So Google is working on tensor processing units, TPUs. There are bunch of other specific things going on. So again, one of the things that probably Indian companies can have a presence in is to make new designs for AI co-processors and custom AI co-processors, etc. But nevertheless, so that is again a design, that is again a demand segment which will be important. So these two are things which will probably drive newer demands, and that's the hope that with that hope, all countries are having all these industrial policies and subsidies. Japan, Europe, or US, etc. So all that is the hope that this demand will be significant enough to overcome the fragmentation and the costs which will come from that fragmentation. They will still be lesser than the demand which will come from these segments. That's the hope. But yeah, I mean, all this is difficult to predict how it will pan out 5 to 10 years from now. But these are the segments you should keep an eye on. Also newer communication technologies. So the long promise of 5G, 6G, etc. If that delivers, so then you will have another demand vector coming from those areas.
So Shaurya's question is also along the lines of this kind of difficult to predict future, but perhaps you can take the same thought that you were on right now and talk about it geopolitically, because he's asking with kind of this uh, major investments in semiconductors and semiconductor fabs, what global significance does this have? So perhaps we can talk about uh, the competition with the US and China and all of that.
So the fab we are talking about is the Tata fab. Which what fab was?
So he doesn't mention which fab. Even I was confused what state of the art fab. But
Yeah, so I
let's
mean,
that's it.
if we are talking about fab in India, that's the only one that so it must be that. So see, it will do production at 28 nanometers, which now you know from what I've spoken, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometers are the cutting edge. So 28 nanometer obviously is bigger transistor size, not the most cutting edge, but it is a good node to begin with, right? So because this node is like an all-rounder node, the products which come out from this go into automotive, go into medical devices, go into many products, go into some laptops. So you can, it's a good base load to start off with. But the production capacity of this is very small. So it is 50,000 wafer starts per month. Okay. Just to give you a rough idea, across the world, the total capacity will be some million wafer starts per month if you add up all the capacity across the world. So, more than 2-3 million per month. In that, you are taking a portion which is 50,000 wafer starts per month. You can, you know how big it is, right? So it's not going to make a big dent in the world's manufacturing capability. But as I said, the significance is for India that you had a vulnerability where you didn't even know how to make commercial chips. And remember, to make this setup, if you are able to get one good setup up here, you know how to do advanced manufacturing, you know how to work with other players in the industry, how to create. It's not just technical talent, you need process talent, you need managerial talent to run these complex operations, right? You will need to figure out how do you process water so that you can reduce water consumption, you can improve the quality of water which is required here. So it's like you have to fix many things to get this running. So the best case hope with this project is that you will have the critical mass of talent 5-6 years down the line to build more such plants going ahead. And India's position as a place where none of the investors want to put money in this sector will go away if this sector, if this project, the state of the art fab works, right? That's the hope. So, but it's not going to be a big dent in the world market for the reasons.
So Josh also had another question, which kind of takes off from the conversation yesterday, and he's talking about the recycling industry that kind of can be present, and resource management with kind of the production of chips. Now that demand is increasing, what space does this industry have, and how can that sustain demand?
Yeah, I mean, it it is an important industry of itself, but with respect to the semiconductor sector and what I told, it's not a big mover. Like no one will it will not switch an investor's decision either way because of the recycling policies. But yeah, it's an industry which is important for its own reasons. So, but not so much on sector.
So there was a question that had come in yesterday, and it was about uh, how semiconductor fabs are water intensive, and what was kind of the logic of building a plant in Gujarat. Do you want to take that up?
Sure, sure, yeah. So first of all, yeah, the one thing that water intensive thing is right. Water is required, but a lot of this water can be treated, retreated, etc. So I mean, I always tell people there are droughts in Taiwan also. I mean, Taiwan has had fears of that, but Taiwan is the world's most advanced manufacturer of chips, right? So it clearly means you can do. So it doesn't mean you have to solve Bangalore's water problem and only then you should start making fabs, right? It's not that you. These are India is a big enough country where there are different things that can happen in different places. Okay, that is one. So water requirement does exist in Gujarat. What I have heard is there is a plan to get water from the Narmada Delta, and route the water from there for this project, because Dholera itself, the nearest river is Sabarmati, it's 50 kilometers away from it. So near it, there is no immediate source, but the idea is there is a canal network of near the Narmada Delta, and that water will probably be used for this. That's the idea. And as to why Gujarat, there were two or three players in the like there is Karnataka, there is Tamil Nadu, there is Gujarat, all three were players. All three states have semiconductor policies apart from the union government. So all three of them were giving their own incentives on top of what the union government is giving as well. So, and one of the thing is, yeah, this Dholera project has also been uh, a vision that the current political dispensation wants to have, because Dholera industrial region on the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor is an important project in this government's view. So they want that part also to succeed. So it's a complex thing, you know, there are multiple reasons which come into play for any investor decision. I think Gujarat, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu are the only three players which, anyways, have some presence in this segment or some vision to try and make a mark in the semiconductor industry. So it's not the end of it, because this is just one fab. I think there might be other fabs also. The minister has said that there are other projects as well. So you might see something coming up in Karnataka or Tamil Nadu as well.
Understood. No, yes, they did kind of put this in the question where they were asking if the logic behind this is economics or politics, but I think you kind of mentioned it's a bit of both. Um, on the design side of things, you mentioned that one of India's comparative advantages is in perhaps designing semiconductor chips. In terms of policy, um, are we looking at capitalizing on that? Because of course, in a lot of these circles, a lot of the conversation is about actually doing production and about the new fabs and everything. But are we looking at a policy dimension towards the design side of things as well?
Correct. Yeah, that's a good question. So again, it's a 20-year journey in design itself, right? So again, you have to look at multiple things. One, you need to improve the quantity and quality of talent, right? So even though, yeah, 20% of world's design engineers, the government estimates are already in India, right? So 300,000 design engineers are working in India. So obviously you have some presence there, but you need to improve the quality of that talent as well, right? So currently they are working for MNCs. You would want to be able to have good VLSI design courses at engineering level, such that some of these people also have deep knowledge that they can use to architect new chips, not just after working for these firms for a few years, go out and start their own firms which have Indian intellectual property, right? So that is one. Second, you need robust intellectual property protection, right? So imagine if I have a patent for a new architecture for AI coprocessor. I should be confident that it will not be stolen by someone else and someone will start making the same product on it, right? So you need very robust intellectual property mechanisms. That takes time. The third one is, yeah, can you support some of these companies to prototype and to get them to marketable stage, right? So they have some idea. Can you help them to get market? That is probably something that can be done in quicker time. But again, so this 20 years, improving education is a 10-year journey. Improving intellectual property mechanisms is a 5-year journey, and probably improving some of these, giving them support to current startups is a 2-3 year journey. right? So this is how I would look at it.
Right, right. I don't see any other questions as of now, and we are also at the end of our time, so I guess that works out quite well. Thank you once again, Pranay. I would like to once again mention to everyone, Pranay Kovtastane is the chair of high tech geopolitics at the Takshashila Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for these two lectures of the masterclass, and kind of giving us the uh, first the supply side of things, and then looking at India's policy with semiconductors. I think this has been really helpful. I think people would have found this really useful. Thank you so much, Pranay, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks all. Bye.